Hi.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. So the We Animals Media team and I wanted us to get together to have a talk about our careers and our work. There's a lot of overlap happening, a lot of things we can do and are doing together between you and, well, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism
Yeah.
and We Animals Media. We've both founded a media NGO that supports environmental issues and animal issues. And I think people were excited to hear us have a conversation and ask us some questions. So you founded Ecostorm in 2003, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Ecostorm really grew out of myself and a colleague had spent a long time doing investigative work for charities and a little bit for the media. And we realized there was a bit of a space um, for a slightly more professional organization that in some ways operated as hired guns in this sort of environmental sphere. There's a very well-known environmental group called the EIA, the Environmental Investigation Agency. Back in the sort of 90s, they had sort of pioneered the use of undercover investigations, dummy companies, the use of hidden cameras and undercover agents to tackle issues like illegal logging and deforestation, but also the ivory trade. In some ways, we wanted to take some of those tactics and apply them not just to one or two subjects, but to whatever subjects people wanted us to work on. Initially, a lot of that was uh, in the sort of animal welfare field for farm animal investigations, etc.
Mhm.
But the sort of idea um, grew from there, and it started off quite small, working for one or two groups, and then particularly as years went by, we increasingly started getting the media interested in working with us as well. So if a program wanted to investigate a particular type of subject, intensive farming, for example, they would bring us in to get those more tricky bits that perhaps they weren't able to. And it's run pretty much like that ever since. And in that time, a lot of the issues that we were working on have now become pretty mainstream. And I think that the global interest in them has increased. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah, we'll get to that.
your background's similar, isn't it?
Um, well, actually, I remember hearing about Ecostorm way back when and thinking, "Oh, I want to work with them." My background is, woman with a camera out in the world, chasing all the stories that were of interest to me. There were many. I accumulated quite a mass of material of the atrocities that animals withstand at our hands, but I was just throwing everything on a hard drive. I was barely getting any of the work actually out. I didn't have a strategy.
Mm.
And it was only in recent years that I really started getting organized and thought, okay, well, let's bring on more people. Let's start a media agency. So my project, We Animals, became We Animals Media. And now we're following in the steps of organizations like Ecostorm. And did the Bureau for Investigative Journalism grow out of Ecostorm, or how did
No,
that
it's a
relationship
very
go?
no, it's a very separate organisation. The bureau was set up really to help fill the void in investigative journalism that's happened. It's been a phenomenon that's happened globally, and particularly in the States. Actually, we began to see lots of not-for-profit newsrooms that were
Mhm.
philanthropically funded being set up. The idea being that they would have the resources and the time to take on the stories that perhaps the more mainstream media either couldn't or wouldn't cover. Now in the States, it's quite an established sort of way for investigative journalism to work. And the Bureau was the first sort of independent and more formal investigative newsroom that was set up in that way. Um, and it's actually traditionally the Bureau was more focused on sort of human rights issues, conflict issues, and so on. But in the past 4 or 5 years, it began to take on food and farming, which is the strand that I've worked with them on. So no, it's very separate to Ecostorm, but the subject
Yeah.
matters now are very similar.
Are you the person credited for bringing more of that subject matter to the Bureau?
Well, I guess I was brought on originally to work on a strand looking at the use of antibiotics and the human health impacts of that. To start with, we looked very much at the use of antibiotics in intensive livestock farming, which about 5 or 6 years ago became a very big issue. I think what happened was the Bureau realized through its work on antibiotics that actually this was just one aspect of a much bigger issue, which I guess is industrial farming and food production. So as the antibiotic project moved more off into looking into the human consequences of that and sort of human healthcare use of antibiotics, the food strand moved much more into looking at intensive farming, the environmental impacts of that, some animal welfare work and so on. So it grew out of that superbugs project, really.
And that's your specialty from what I've seen, is taking a really deep dive and making a lot of connections between the various welfare issues, clean meat issues, antibiotics, environment. And I'd recommend that people check out the recent story that we did together. Well, it was mostly you. We contributed the images, but it's Andrew on the trail of global meat production. So I recommend everyone check that one out. But that took you all over the place.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Well, the actual idea for that, somebody raised back, it was about the time that the lockdown was starting for this year because of the COVID crisis. And some conversations I'd have with people, they said, look, maybe it's time to actually bring some of this 15, 20 years spent working on these issues into one place. So that was very much my lockdown masterpiece, for want of a better word. I'll let others judge if it really is a masterpiece, but the idea was to
I
put all of
remember
that
when
in
you
one
showed
place.
me the initial. I remember when you showed us the initial draft. I mean, how many words was that?
I can't remember the initial
70,000
one.
or something?
It grew from there was a vague idea to do about 6,000. I think we ended up with about 12,500 on the page. And that was after a very substantial editing process as well. But yeah, so the idea with that long read that we collaborated on, really in a nutshell, was to bring together all of these disparate strands and different aspects of this industry into one place. And I think, although it doesn't actually sort of reach a conclusion about what the solution is, I think it highlights, perhaps in a way that few other sort of pieces of reportage have done, just the full breadth of the problem of the current system of industrial meat production. And I think to some degree that probably explains the level of interest that it got, both in the States, in Europe, and beyond. Actually, I mean, there was a phenomenal amount of interest when that published, and even now we're still getting people contacting us and so on.
That is a perfect segue into exactly what I wanted to hear about. How do you measure success for the work that you're producing? Like for us, it's a number of things. Of course, it's the easy measurables from socials and clicks and likes and the data that we get from that. It's about outreach, people who reach out to us, and shares and discussions that ensue, but we don't get to see a lot of that. Um, and so it's hard to get a true sense of exactly what's going on. Sometimes these things simply take time. I think for us, we know that the conversations that we are generating and the images that are the ideas that come from our images and the conversations that come from our images and videos are going to be generative over a long period of time.
Yeah,
We know that they will help campaigners. We know that they will help policy. We know that images and videos are proof of things and people need to see, but some of the stuff is pretty intangible in the short term. So what's starting with the article that you're talking about, what have you seen and how do you guys measure?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky, a very difficult question, really, particularly in journalism, which by its very nature is really about, delivering news. It's about, I guess raising public awareness is probably the number one sort of outcome of the work we do. That's the aim, I think, to start with, is to sort of bring these issues and sort of project them into as big an audience as possible. Obviously, it's very useful when we have partners like The Guardian on board and others, because they have a huge
Yes.
worldwide reach, which is fantastic. I think when you get beyond that, and it's something the Bureau's been sort of toying with for some years, it's quite a challenging area to actually say, how can this material now be used to actually bring about change? I think one way which has increasingly become more tangible in recent years is that some of the material gathered during these investigations can be sort of repurposed. So it has its
Yep.
initial sort of headline sort of purpose with an article in a newspaper, sometimes with TV and so on. But what's certainly something the Bureau has been doing is trying to then repackage some of its findings and make sure that those findings are sort of summarized in such a way that others who are more involved in the campaigning side of things, whether that's political or raising awareness or advocacy work, that they're then equipped with the findings of this journalism. And it's, in a sense, it gives the findings a lifespan beyond the initial headline, which, to be fair, however good the journalism and the photography, it quickly becomes yesterday's news, doesn't it? So I think it's about giving the findings longevity.
Absolutely. We really need to give it longevity because this is just the world of content overload, isn't it?
Yeah,
So we're
yeah.
just
And I think,
competing to get past having people read the headlines and the subtitles. And we're doing
yeah,
the same thing with giving longevity to our work by adding everything, all the best bits of our work to the We Animals archive. So
yeah,
We
yeah,
Animals Media runs the We Animals archive, and we have over 10,000 videos and photos, and that's available to anyone helping animals, be they academics and campaigners,
yeah,
media. And not a financially very generative model because we give everything away for free because we want it
yeah,
as far and wide as possible. And so our work is funded by donors, philanthropy, grants, uh, which is also interesting and different from the traditional media
yeah, yeah.
model, isn't it? But more of us are having to go in that direction so that we can, so that there's a place for these important stories.
Well, I think with it's important you mentioned that, because I think without that, actually, I don't think any of these outfits would exist, because the mainstream media, and I think the more mainstream sort of campaigning world, even, they maybe don't have the resources to take on these issues in such a dedicated way. So I think this philanthropic funding has really filled that void to help get this material out and used in different ways. Just something that I wanted to pick up on. I think with the long read that we collaborated on, I think one of the specific purposes of that was to do it in such a way where it wasn't just a news headline. It's a bit of journalism and photography, which put together, hopefully, will become almost the sort of go-to piece of writing around, modern industrial meat. And somebody did comment to me that it sort of felt like that, because even when newspapers run the sort of individual exposés, they sort of disappear. But I'm hoping with the long read that we worked on, that will have a sort of shelf life beyond just a few weeks. And it, in a sense, is a resource, I guess, for people, isn't it? Because it's so detailed with so many images and so many different perspectives, if you like. So,
do you see a way for it to continue to be purposed and repurposed on like simply by other media outlets running it? I mean, beyond our own, do you think like this could be duplicated and translated different publications and because it ran in the Guardian, are you able, I guess you're able to sell it elsewhere, aren't you?
yeah. I mean, the actual the long read, which is the version we published on Medium,
Yeah, right.
is available to people if they want to use it. And yeah,
Mhm.
that was raised, actually, that there's already been some interest in getting it translated into Spanish or Portuguese, particularly for the Latin American market. So I think, yeah, that would be good. I guess as ever, it comes down to time and resources and so on. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
foreign language versions of this sort of stuff would be incredibly useful, because, let's face it, not everybody speaks English, although Britain
Yep.
seems to think everybody does.
I want to go back a little bit. I mean, people are really curious about our work, how we got into it. I'd love to just step back a bit and hear how you got into investigative journalism, how and why.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I sort of had a background in I guess, more sort of campaigning work and activism in the 90s. But I then started to do sort of freelance journalism and freelance video work. I guess I sort of moved from sort of being the activist and involved in the activism to documenting that using camcorders. It all seems terribly old-fashioned now, but you had actual cameras with tapes, hi8 tapes, and so on. And then I guess it was a natural evolution from being involved in the activism and the campaigns to beginning to document it, give the pictures to the media to cover. And at some point, it's quite difficult to pinpoint exactly. I just realized that actually we could also tell the story. We didn't need to rely on others to do it. So having come from started off doing freelance work for magazines, newspapers, and so on. In 2003, we took the plunge to actually set up an agency that would begin to do that. So it wasn't, there was never really a game plan to become a specialist in food or farming. By nature, we were covering a lot of environmental issues and activism and so on. But as time went on and we did more and more in that field, it just sort of snowballed really. And suddenly we became a sort of, certainly for a while, the sort of go-to people for anything relating to industrial food production. So how about you?
There was not really a plan, just a lot of passion. And the activism was not the deciding factor. It was not the beginning. It was a love of photography, a love of conflict photography, street photography. I became quite obsessed with that work and the history of that work. And I took to the street with my camera and assisted other people, and just it became like this insatiable thing for me. But I knew I wanted to do something with it, something relevant, something effective. And it was a while before I found my story, which was, the animal story. And I was very happy with that because I could combine my two passions, which was my love of the camera and the adventure around all of that and the storytelling, with my concern for animals. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was going to have my life's work basically cut out for me.
Right.
I hope that we'll see a lot of the industries that I document, and maybe all of them in my lifetime, not sure, but I'll certainly push for that through We Animals Media. And it's been a journey of just becoming more strategic. Again, it was much more about me and what I wanted to do in the beginning, and it's evolved into strategizing with NGOs and media and journalists to be as effective as possible. And that's our priority now. And I know some people want to hear from us about the mistakes that we made earlier on, so that they can get that advice and avoid that. And I think that my advice there would be to collaborate sooner, and to not fuss over the tiny details of things, but to, create good collaborations with people you respect, and effective media, effective NGOs. I've had a few blips where I've partnered up with NGOs who didn't have any media strategy whatsoever. And so it was a bit of wasted time. So I would look very critically about who I want to work with and move forward as an entity rather than on my own.
Yeah, I think that the collaborative work actually is increasingly the way forward, and actually possibly the only way to actually do this now, because there's certainly on the journalism side, there's a strength in numbers when you're taking on sometimes really quite powerful corporations. And certainly with the Bureau now, when we do the big stories, we will partner not only with The Guardian, but we will partner with newspapers and media outlets in Brazil, across Europe, in the Far East. So on a day of publication, not only is that story amplified in sometimes 30 different outlets, which just gives a huge momentum to the story, it also makes it much more difficult for companies or others who might want to try and silence that work or thwart it in some way. So I think the sort of collaboration on the journalism and indeed on the video images and stills photography too is definitely the way forward. And increasingly in the work I do, we are seeing collaborations between lots of different NGOs and campaigning organizations too, lots of coalitions. And I know that can sometimes come with a lot of bureaucracy and, as you say, sometimes there's a sense of a bit too much squabbling over small details rather than the big
Yeah.
picture. But again, when they get that right, suddenly you've got 50 organizations demanding change on a specific issue. It's something we've seen a lot actually around the Amazon rainforest crisis in the last few years. There's been a lot of joint action with sort of joint letters signed by academics, leading NGOs, some of the top scientists in the world coming together saying we've got to demand change from the ground right through to the UN and to international governmental levels. So something just to go back on what you mentioned, there was an observation for me with your work and We Animals. I think something that sort of caught my eye and I think has marked out We Animals media is that the quality of the photography and the video journalism is much, much higher. And I think perhaps that's unexpected for a lot of people, because I think we're quite used to seeing the sort of grainy undercover type pictures, which, to be fair, is more what I've been involved in over the years with the hidden cameras or the sort of night shot on the camcorders. But I think with We Animals, I think what surprises people is just the quality of it, but also that you're able to actually get that access.
It's really exciting to see how much the quality of animal photojournalism has increased in the last decade or so. Like you said, a lot of campaigns were using images that were shot by activists with a camcorder, not with people who are trained with any technical skills to take poignant, technically perfect images. And that is so important to get people to engage. As you know, it's so difficult to get people to engage in these stories at all, especially stories of cruelty, because to confront cruelty is to confront our complicity in that cruelty. So you need every tool that you can to get people to look. And one of those tools is really strong images, poignant, effective, connective. And I'm super happy that We Animals Media has been able to contribute to the mentoring of that over a number of years. A lot of people are just picking that up on their own. Photographers who aren't activists are going into animal photojournalism because it's an important place to be. And in fact, that's also one of the reasons that we published the book Hidden, which is our new book. I'm getting my copies delivered today. It would be really cool if they arrived at the door right now. But Hidden it's called Hidden Animals in the Anthropocene. And this is a compilation of 38 animal photojournalists who have done incredible work globally. It's a 5-pound book, and it's a tome and an indictment of what is and what should never again be. But the point is that it's really high quality work, and it's going to continue to set the bar higher and higher for animal photojournalism and for campaigning. So it's pretty exciting. We built a animal photojournalism masterclass as well, because I find that people ask the same questions all the time. How do you gain access? How do you shoot in low light? How do you cope? And so we put together 8 episodes. That's available on our weanimalsmedia.org site. Little plug there. But it's been a worthwhile endeavor, because I think we've had 200 or 300 people by the masterclass so far. We put a lot of effort into it. It looks pro. So really, really happy about that. And it shows that we made a good decision. I mean, maybe 300 people using the masterclass doesn't seem like a high number, but considering how niche it is, I think it's pretty good. Yeah.
And also if they use some of what they'd learned and take away from that masterclass and go off and apply it into whatever projects and work they're doing, it becomes almost immeasurable, doesn't it? Because you don't know the influence that might have, but presumably it's only positive. I can't see any negatives from that. So
we've had so many examples of how people have applied the learnings from the masterclass. So it's a very exciting place of growth, We Animals Media, but also animal photojournalism. And what I really want next is to see all of the wildlife conferences, the conservation conferences open their doors to these stories of all animals, the animals who are raised for meat. And the stories that you're writing, they're so important. They are completely intersectional with the stories of the day that are so important. Welfare is important. Climate change as a result of factory farm is important. The Amazon burning, all of this. And I think that if the competitions continue to exclude all of these hidden animals, it's not going to be a right choice, right? And it's going to be a little bit elitist, like, oh, the wildlife are more important than all of these other animals that we've bred. But the stories are super important.
Yeah, and
Obviously,
I
I think
think
so.
I think it's a really good point, and I sense, and I don't know if it's the same from where you are, but with this current COVID crisis, which has obviously been devastating to so many people globally, and is still with us, I think the interest in this sort of intersection of how we farm animals, the spread of disease,
Mhm.
and some of the consequences of this reliance on cheap industrially produced food. There's a sense, I think, that people are really now looking at that, and that it's moving beyond the sort of traditional green agenda, but into something much more mainstream. I just sense that also politically we will start to see some of these issues really creeping up. I mean, it's difficult certainly here in the UK because obviously we've had COVID, we've also got this Brexit happening. So sometimes climate change and that you could be forgiven for thinking that it's not actually happening. But actually, I think when you strip all that away, I think globally we are going to see a huge level of interest in this area of disease, human health, animal health, how we produce food, and so on. So I think that's quite an interesting area, and it will be interesting next year to see, as you say, if some of this stuff is starting to be discussed and featured in some of these global events and by global institutions.
I think it's inevitable. And I think that in the institutions, the media, the competitions, the overlap of these stories and issues and how they intersect is absolutely unavoidable and really exciting. Like, why exclude these conversations when
Yeah,
these conversations are going to really help patch the problems and fix the problems
yeah,
that we're facing and reporting on? And something that I'm and ever about progress and change and moving forward, I'm really excited about what's ahead for We Animals Media. We continue to, take a close look on what's needed by campaigners. What are the most relevant issues and underreported issues, like fishing and fish sentience, for example.
yeah,
Billions and billions and billions of fish are suffering, but we don't ever really get to see images of them other than like the wildlife and the pretty images and the BBC stuff. So we're moving in that direction, but I'm also looking forward to telling the stories of the future of food, telling the stories of change and progress, because things are pretty dark right now. And while we need to continue showing, illuminating the darkness, we also
mm,
need to show the way ahead and inspire people. So, too often, I think the conversation is about functioning amidst the current paradigm. Like, we have factory farming and we have the protagonists and the antagonists, and we're doing a lot of this, a lot of shouting. That's what our writing and our photography is doing. Like, this is
yeah,
good, this is bad. Okay, well, that's important and that's illuminating, but what's beyond that? Like, I want to get out of this paradigm and show, like, here is the future. Like, let's charge ahead and use our medium, photography and film, to promote the heck out of that. So, and
yeah.
there's, the sky's the limit there as well. So
I
there's
think
a lot of
it's a really good point, isn't it? Because I think actually, although it seems as though a lot of these issues and problems that I guess we collectively are tackling and documenting, it seems as though sometimes there's no scope for change or real progress being made in tackling some of these things. But I've written about this before, but I think there is issues where that there is evidence that change is coming. One of the areas was on the use of antibiotics in industrial livestock farming. I mean, go back a decade and beyond a few sort of maverick scientists and a few quite outspoken NGOs, it wasn't really an area that people were really taking a look at. This peril of antibiotic resistance, the spread of superbugs, particularly that link to farming. But I think in the last decade, and it's something I've contributed to, I hope, with the reporting, we have seen that issue go from quite a marginal, unknown issue to something that actually global bodies and institutions and governments have taken on board and said we've got to stop the overuse of antibiotics, both in human healthcare but also in livestock production. And I think it's a rare example of where actually, there has been some positive change directly from some of the investigative work that has happened. Certainly here in the UK and Europe, I think overall the volume of antibiotics being given to livestock has reduced significantly in recent years. And to give them some credit, the industries themselves have recognized that they needed to do that because of the impacts it would have on human health. Now, I know the picture globally is much more patchy. I know in the States there's still big problems with the use of particular types of antibiotics, and I believe actually in Canada there's still some problems as well. I'm not suggesting that here in the UK and Europe the picture's completely rosy, because we also need to remember that the types of livestock farming that we have often necessitate the use of the antibiotics in the first place. But I just think it's something where there's been a tangible attempt to tackle that problem. And I think some of the investigative work, such like We Animals do in Ecostorm and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, The Guardian, has really fed into that. So it's unfortunately it's quite a rare example at the moment, though. So I guess we need to see a bit more.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, I have this list of questions and all these notes, but we're covering a lot of ground. It's not like we need to go question by question, but there is one here, and it is simply, what has been the most surprising thing to you? Perhaps in the trajectory of your work or the reach of your work.
There's probably several things. I think one of the biggest things that probably shocked me the most in all the years of doing this, it's actually the degree to which some big food companies, both in the States, both in Europe, they feel that it's acceptable to put human health directly at risk because of sometimes very, very poor practices in their supply chains, in the meat supply chains in particular. I mean, here in the UK, we've had several major food scandals in the last decades, from the Horse-Gate debacle through to problems in chicken plants. But I've just been shocked, out of all the stories we've done, that somebody somewhere thinks it's okay to sell meat to the public that is sometimes contaminated with potentially deadly bugs. There's a section on that in the long read that we produced with you, but it's always amazed me that there's not more people being held to account for that. And quite often it is left to journalists and campaigners to go in and expose these problems before anybody gets up and says, yes, there's a problem. It's almost like the government, the regulators, the industry are sort of just waiting for that to happen. They're not regulating themselves. So in terms of just being shocked or surprised, that wasn't an area of the food industry I'd done lots of work on till about 6 years ago. But once we sort of opened that can of worms, we just realized that, that what is happening is completely unacceptable. How about you?
Just about what you said there. Imagine if we could work our way out of our own jobs. I mean, wouldn't that be ideal? Because that would mean that there was proper regulation and oversight and policing and change. I think I would just open a used bookstore if I could work myself out of this out of this job of investigative work, because it's essentially work that we shouldn't have to do. These industries should be absolutely transparent and open to us and to the public. But I digress. What's been most surprising to me, I mean, in one aspect is just the passage of time. Like, how have I been doing this for almost 20 years now? What, I can't believe that. And it's, like I said, from the beginning, I didn't have a plan. Like, okay, in 15 years, I'm going to launch an NGO and all this. It's just been like, okay, what's needed next? What's needed next? Always a mission to improve what I'm doing and, extend what I'm doing. I didn't know that was going to be the trajectory, but here I am. One of the things that's surprising to me right now is the closure of fur farms and the ban of fur farms. I
This has
remember,
come up in Europe, Poland, isn't it? I think I've seen some stuff on this.
yeah, several countries now. It was Norway in the last 2 years, which was surprising because they're such a big producer, and Netherlands, France has just announced the closure, the ending of mink farming, and
Okay.
Poland now as well. And it's interesting with Poland because just, in the last decade, a lot of countries were moving their fur farming to Poland because they could do it at a lower
Okay.
cost. Excuse me. And so that was a big upset. It was a big surprise. And I think it feels surprising to me as someone has just spent so much time literally crawling through mink shit and photographing millions of mink at I've maybe been to, 100 mink farms now in different parts of the world, and it's just so exhausting, and you feel like it's interminable, and the numbers of animals in these industries are just so high, and you're like, "Oh god, I'm working so hard, and I'm so tired, and this is so awful, and is it going to end?" But there is a chain of collaboration. There's just these fantastic collaborations that are happening between the materials we create, the things we write, policy, campaigners,
Yeah.
laws, and things feel like they're just starting to snowball a little bit with perhaps fur farming and regulation around captivity and breeding in captivity and wild catching animals for captivity.
Mm.
We're seeing more and more a ban on animals in circuses. Hopefully, that'll extend to horse racing and rodeos, and we're definitely seeing the greyhound racing industry come to an end. And so, is this a surprise? I guess it feels like a bit of a surprise when you're just in it
Mm.
and you're like, everything is such a freaking emergency and you want everything to end right away. They really need to because of the amount of suffering. And it just feels interminable. But like, here we are. And again, I do think things are snowballing in a positive way. We know that things are
Mm.
getting worse in some regard and better in some regard. Things are getting worse in terms of meat consumption is going up in different parts of the world, but it's, slowly going down in other parts of the world, especially with the rise of plant-based and soon cultivated meat, which will, soon enough be um, available for people general consumption, hopefully at a decent price. Yeah,
I
but
think
I'm looking
people,
forward to just, yeah.
I think people are sort of alongside that. People are beginning to just question their food a bit more. About really where it came from, what was the conditions the animal that made that product was reared in. I'm not suggesting that's a universal thing by a long shot, but I think as a result of years of campaigning by different organizations, years of media exposés, political work, I do think there's a much more of a general consciousness now, at least about just asking the questions. Where does this product come from? What was the sort of hidden chain of that? So I think, yeah,
Mhm.
there's some room for optimism amongst all the gloom, because unfortunately, when you read stories like we've just produced together, it's not a pretty picture, and it's pretty alarming. But I think there's a few shoots of
Mhm.
optimism beginning to come through there.
Yeah.
Just recently, actually, on the back of the huge international outcry about the Amazon fires, which particularly blew up last year, and obviously we've seen a similar problem again this year. We are now seeing in the UK and Europe moves towards legislation that would actually make it a legal requirement for food companies to
Mm.
stamp out deforestation in their supply chains. Now, obviously, that legislation is complex. There will be all sorts of nuances. There will be all sorts of pushbacks. But the fact that that conversation's happening now at the very top of government, and
Mhm.
using a lot of evidence that's been gathered by NGOs, by journalists, and others, I think again it just shows, probably 20 years too late, but things are beginning to sort of go in that right direction.
And
So there's
we'll
some room for optimism.
There is, and we're just gonna keep pushing the envelope as well. Once the world goes cage-free for hens, I'm not gonna stop. I mean, we still have to expose the conditions there and help continue to reform and, hold accountable. For example, there's a Canadian company, egg producer, and they're sort of seen the top tier of organic, not cage free, but there's like they're extended cages they can sort of fly between here and there. And everyone feels really good about eating eggs from this company. So I was in I was in one of their farms recently. I can't name them yet, but I have now seen, this holy, like, oh wow, I'm proud to eat these $12 eggs because they're just so ethical, antibiotic free, free range, all
Yeah,
these
yeah.
designations. But you know what? That's not very good for the animals either. And so we're going to keep pushing. I've been to dairy farms with all of the fancy designations as well. And while, of course, those are improvements, we're just going to keep pushing because there are still practices that should not exist in all of these industries.
Yeah, no, the certification issue is it's been a theme of quite a lot of stories that we've done here. And it always seems, although there is some certification schemes that are much better than others, it's almost, but by nature, when these farms are certified, they're sort of crying out for somebody to take a closer look because, as has been shown time and again, the label on the box doesn't always match the reality. Not in every case, but certainly in some cases, you know.
Maybe this will be one of our future collaborations.
Yeah,
We're winding down for time, but there are a
yeah.
couple questions. Um, One of them for both of our organizations is, do you have photographers and journalists working around the clock documenting these issues and world events? I'll let you start.
No, I guess my answer to that, I wish we did.
Yeah.
We no, we're certainly at the bureau. We're an incredibly small team, but we're supported by a fantastic team of editors, producers, and so on. But the actual reporting team's quite small. But what we have done in recent years is really set up. We were talking about it earlier. Collaborative networks. So now, teams of journalists in multiple countries will work together on a
Mhm.
single story. So, and as we approach publication, as we're doing the research, yeah, more and more time is spent. I'd be exaggerating if I said we sort of worked round the clock, but there's certainly some sleepless nights just before we publish.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that.
How
And
about
for
how
us,
about with you?
yeah, for us, I mean, same thing. I wish we had people working around the clock. We're not there yet. I will say that there are people working around the clock on documenting animal use and abuse. They're not necessarily working with We Animals Media right now, but what we want to do is continue to build relationships with these people. So once they've produced a body of work, add it to our We Animals archive so
Mm,
that we can help make that work that's happening around the clock available to campaigners and media worldwide. And
yeah,
I'll also say that while we are growing our list of contributors, there are things that just you know slow things down. I mean, I always feel a sense of urgency. I'm always trying to reconcile that sense of urgency, but it just takes time. Someone will reach out to us and say, "Hey, I'm a photographer in Chile." And it's, conversations and where are you next and what do you have? And let's go through your images and let's make a plan for another story. And then they can do the story in 6 weeks or in 8 weeks from now. And I'm like, I just want everything to happen right now. And, but, maybe we are the next New York Times, and we'll get there, big budget, and we'll have people around the clock. I mean, that would be great. I think
yeah,
I
yeah,
think our work's important enough. It
yeah,
is.
absolutely. I think just it's a good point though. On a related note, that some of the work we do, these investigations can take 6, 7, 8 months. It's
Mhm.
a very long process from an initial tip off or an initial bit of research that gets us interested in something to doing rolling out the full investigation and reporting. And then inevitably, we need to think about the writing, the production, if we're doing
Yeah.
videos, or what photos are we going to use. And then for almost all of the big stories, there's then a legal process where lawyers have to be consulted. Obviously, the allegations have
Yes.
to be put to the companies or others involved. And it's quite often, I think, for people who perhaps aren't familiar with how this work works, it's quite often there's only 2 or 3 names on the article and perhaps the photographer. But in reality, there could have been a team of perhaps 10 or even 20 people working behind the scenes to get that story onto the page. And I think in some
Mhm.
ways they're the unsung heroes because they don't get the public credit, but they're the people that are actually making sure that it is edited accurately, it is safe legally, that it actually makes sense, and that it looks good, and all of that, is a huge process, particularly for the really big stories. So I think it's worth, just for people perhaps unfamiliar with it. Yeah, when you read the next story or see it, there's a huge amount of effort that's probably in some ways undocumented that goes into that.
Yeah. Thank you for saying all that. That is really important. One thing I'd like to add to that is fundraising.
Yes, yes, of course, yeah.
Because we need to get grants and fundraise so that we can pay editors and photographers and lawyers and get all of our ducks in a row. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And there's another question here. Do you have a favorite photo that you've taken, or do you have a favorite story that you've written? Let you go first.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a favorite photo, because I haven't taken. I think in terms of actually, this may sound a bit sort of obvious, but I think in terms of a favorite story, it probably is the long read that we've just produced with you, Joe.
I'm so
I think
glad.
'cause I think it was just so satisfying to bring together and distill down 15, 16 years worth of work and put it in one place. And again, we started off with a pretty blank sheet, and there was so much we could include. We could have written 30,000, 40,000 words, but we had to bring it down. So I think it's, in terms of satisfaction, and I think in terms of sort of just presenting a story in a really powerful, impactful way, I think that would certainly be up there.
Mhm.
And judging by the reaction there's been, I think it was, people were interested, because I don't think, I'm not aware of anything that's been produced that's quite come from that position, the sort of inside out. It's yeah, that would certainly be up there in terms of favorite stories. Although the subject matter is by nature distressing.
Mhm. I'm so glad we got to contribute to it. Uh,
Yeah, well, I
thanks
think
for
that with, when you have a story that is that long, you have to have the images to help
Mhm.
illustrate it and carry it. And I honestly don't think it would have worked if we'd done it just as more of a sort of essay. I know some
Mhm.
publications do that, don't they? Will run 15,000 words text, but I think you're only going to pick up a certain amount of readers with that. I think the fact that the long read we did, um, was so well presented, and it was quite bold in the use of images. We didn't shy away from showing the realities of each of these things.
Mhm.
I think all of that, will mean it hopefully is around for some time. Um, so, how about you on the favorite photo? Because I guess that's probably more accurate for you.
It is. I'm just taking a note here so I can circle back to something you said. I don't, I mean, I have a couple of favorite photos, but more accurately, I have a favorite type of photo. And it is an image that is typically wide angle, so I'm really close to the subject matter. And it shows an individual within the frame, and there's a connectivity, eye contact, and the image also shows the context. So whether it's a rabbit next in line for slaughter, or a calf 20 minutes old, still wet from birth, and in a wheelbarrow about to be dumped into a veal crate where he or she will obviously, spend the rest of their days. So they are images that I see as complete. A lot of images need some storytelling and some context.
Mm.
Um, you may feel you need to know a location or additional details, but some of these images, they just speak for themselves. And
Yeah, I think you're.
because, yeah.
So I was going to say, I think we used your image in the wheelbarrow actually in the long read, didn't we? And I
Mhm.
think it was one that there was some comments on, actually, because it just sort of, as you said, it just encapsulated something in a particular time and moment. It didn't need too much explanation because it was fairly clear what was happening, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my favorite kind of image. I have a question for you from me, which I'm gonna hopefully you have a great answer, and I'll wrap it into my personal work life. So, in this very distracted age of social media, and we're busier than ever, are you successful at making time for deep, concentrated work? I find it very difficult, especially as someone who's running an NGO now, and there's a lot of projects and a lot of staff. It is a big challenge, but it's something I definitely need to do the best possible work. So how do you navigate that?
In all honesty, with some difficulty, because as you say, in this age of particularly at the moment, where huge teams of journalists and investigators are working remotely because of the COVID situation, there is a constant stream of social media feeds, Zoom calls, Skype calls, WhatsApp messages, Signal message, all the different channels, as well as emails and as well as normal traditional phone calls. And quite often, and I'm giving a very honest answer here, but quite often I will get to, say, a Wednesday in the week and I haven't actually done anything except talk to people and have meetings. And so what I've increasingly are doing is trying to keep that into certain days of the week.
Mhm.
And then on other days actually say, well, this is a day where we're going to do something more functional, whether that's some reporting or we're going to do some writing or we're going to cut some video that we need to use in a particular story. So much more practical or
Mhm.
creative things, because otherwise if you try and do it all, and this I'm sure this is the case for you and all the other journalists and photographers out there as well, you just end up with a sort of mishmash of slightly unproductive days. Because I think the problem with this subject matter and these stories is there's more and more interest, so there's more and more demand, more and more people want to talk to us, more and more emails need answering, which is all fantastic, but actually there's only so many hours in the day and so much resources, and as we acknowledged earlier, quite small teams producing this work. So um, to answer the question in a line, just trying to structure the week a bit
Yeah.
better. Um,
That's a good answer. Structure is definitely something I'm trying to implement more of. I tend not to book any meetings on Mondays, and that helps a bit, and I'm gonna build in more of that structure. And something else that I learned from Seth Tibbett, he's the founder of Tofurkey, and of course, he
okay.
has an empire now of, plant-based alternatives. Well, he started out with an idea, just like I started out with an idea. I didn't set out to become the executive director of an NGO. It's how it evolved. But that doesn't mean that I have the skills for that and and all of the components of that. And so Seth's advice in his autobiography, which by the way is very funny and very good, is to fire yourself from as many of the jobs within the organization and company as you can. And so initially you have to start out by doing the bookkeeping and the communications and the operations, but as quickly as you can, yeah, hire competent people for that. And I've certainly done that in We Animals Media. We have really passionate, smart, competent people working with us, and I'm more than happy to hand over all those things that I'm not good at doing so that I can do what I'm good at, which is, the deep thinking on ideas and progress and communications and taking photos, of course, and
Yeah,
some
yeah.
writing. So I
Yeah,
just
I think
hope
it's
to continue and refine that and continue on that path so I can buy back more of my time.
I guess it's quite it's particularly an issue for you guys because I my sense is that We Animals Media, the sort of the recognition of it has grown quite rapidly in recent years, particularly, hasn't it? It's I think actually it was only a couple of years ago I came across you properly. But now you sort of you hear about We Animals Media, we see it on social media a lot. There's sort of a sense people are talking about it. So I guess there is a particular pressure on you as the founder, as well as heading it up, to sort of do everything and be everywhere and be across everything. And it's a difficult thing, I guess, to suddenly just say, actually, I can't do it.
Yeah, well, maybe that I feel the pressure of being a figurehead and not messing up, always
Yeah.
sounding as good as I can as far as I can. Like, oh gosh, what pressure. I don't like that. But certainly I don't feel the pressure so much to be good at all the things because I'm certainly not good at all the things. But you're right about the trajectory of WHAM. I love our acronym, by the way, We Animals Media,
Yeah, yeah.
WHAM. I just love it. I love the trajectory of WHAM because we just have so many people applying to work with us and who want to be contributors and volunteer with us. So it's just showing me that we're on the right path. And additionally, our funding is fairly stable, which is a godsend, especially during
Mm.
COVID. But people want to invest in our growth as well. So yeah, I'm just going to keep building like mad. It's a lot of work,
Yes.
but it's worthwhile work. Now, we should wrap up,
Yeah.
but give us a plug. Where can people see your work? Where can they follow your work? What are your websites and socials?
Yeah, well, the best place for the most of the investigative work is tbij.com. That's the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. www.tbij.com. And on there's all the subject matters that the Bureau covers, which are many and varied. But there's a new project page for its food and farming content called Eating the Earth, that's quite prominent. If people are interested in certainly the recent work over the last 2 years, that's a pretty good starting point. Similarly, on The Guardian, there is as part of the environment page, there's a section called Animals Farmed, which is their fantastic ongoing series purely focused on industrial food production and intensive farming globally. You can find that on the Guardian site. Most of its stories feature quite prominently in the main paper and online, but there's a good project page there which has the stuff. They're probably the best two.
Fantastic. And with us, it's weanimalsmedia.org, and we want people far and wide using our archive, as many of you do. That's weanimalsarchive.org. We've got our masterclass. We have all sorts of interesting projects ongoing with Andrew Wasley as well. I also encourage people to check out Animals Farmed at The Guardian. I remember when that first came out, Andrew, I was so happy. I was like, look at this progress, us media specialists, and to have a partner like that, a world leading partner like The Guardian.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, and it's interesting actually that, in fact, this is probably quite a good place to end, because there was recently some sort of academic study done of how the world's media was failing to properly investigate and report on some of the impacts of meat production and intensive food production and climate change. And there was an awful lot of points made, but I think in its own words, one of the rare sort of shoots of hope or things that was bucking the trend was the Guardian's Animal Farm series, because it was seen as being completely unique for an international media partner to have such a focus on an issue like this. So that was quite nice to see, because I've obviously been involved with that strand since it launched. But it's a good place because it brings together a lot of the best reporting, the best photography, the best videos on this issue. Of course, we need to amplify it out way beyond just The Guardian, but it's a good starting point. That's my plug for The Guardian.
Look at us. They should be sending us a paycheck for this alone.
Cool.
All right. Well, such a pleasure speaking with
thank
you.
Yeah.
And thanks for taking the time. And I will see you on the emails and the internets very shortly.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe. Cheers.
Bye.